Yeah. My approach to the Gospel according to John follows largely from my studies of Raymond Brown's two-volume work on the Gospel according to John. And now, he says that the Gospel of John went through 5 stages of editing, and there were 3 different persons involved in that process over time. Now, it's necessary to understand my approach to the particular passages that you're referring to. The Paraclete passages, where Jesus speaks of someone to come after him who's called the Paraclete, in John chapter 14, 15, and 16, have different layers of material regarding the Paraclete. And the way in which Raymond Brown puts the layers together are slightly different from the way I conceive it. Of course, I come to this from a Muslim perspective. I would like to see Muhammad mentioned there, but at the same time, I believe that a very careful sifting of the material and looking at Raymond Brown's detailed arguments leads me to take a different angle. At a certain point. I see where, at a certain point, he has tried to make it Jesus, the Holy Spirit, coming to indwell the Christians, and I see that argument is weak, and it is more likely that the earliest layer of Paraclete sayings was about a human being to come after Jesus, and that the early church turned this into the Holy Spirit to indwell in Christians.
So the only reason I brought that up is if you believe that there is something still inspired there, what is the standard that you can use to tell us what in John or Matthew or Mark or Luke is still from God and what is not? Is it not then, as you said in your opening, is it your Islamic beliefs?
My Islamic beliefs to a large extent guides me. I should not try to hide that fact. This is where I begin. At the same time, scholars do try to come up with criteria for determining what is early, what is late. For example, I mentioned John Meyer. The criterion of embarrassment, for example. He gives us an example, the interaction between John the Baptist and Jesus. To many scholars, the way it is mentioned in Mark's Gospel was embarrassing for the early church, and they would not have invented it because it is embarrassing to themselves. They would more likely invent things which would be in their favor, rather than something that they would have to then try to explain away later on. So that is one criterion. I look at these criteria that historians use, and I try to put all of that information together, and in the end, to arrive at a position which is at once faithful to my Muslim tradition, and at the same time very informed about the facts of the matter as discussed by historians.
Well, certainly you would be aware that there are many believing scholars who are fully aware of Myers and all the liberals, and yet they continue to believe that the New Testament is a consistent whole. And what do you do then when you see someone like myself who knew all this stuff, to be honest with you, before you did, because I went to Fuller, and believe me, you go to Fuller Seminary, you're going to hear all this from the beginning. And yet, I do not accept the naturalistic worldview behind that. How do you deal with the existence of that scholarship in light of the fact that it seems that you bring the same worldview to the examination of the Qur'an that I bring to the Bible? You and I, it sounds like, have the same approach to our sacred texts, but you're using a completely different approach when you approach mine. This is something we've talked about many times before, but I still think it's vitally important. How do you deal with shifting to a completely different worldview to criticize my text when you would object to my using that worldview to criticize yours?
I don't believe that I am inconsistent in this. The way I see it is that in studying the Quran, I listen to Muslim scholars, but I also read works by non-Muslim scholars who criticize the Quran. I read works by Christian missionaries who try to point out errors in the Quran, who try to prove that it is not of divine origin. After looking at all of the information presented both by Muslims in favor of the Quran as a sacred text and information presented by non-Muslims against the Quran as a sacred text, I then make up my own mind as to where the facts lead. And then I have a view which could be nuanced. It may not necessarily be the view that an average Muslim may hold. It may be a more nuanced and particular view. In a similar way, I have certain beliefs regarding Jesus and who he is, based on my Muslim background. And at the same time, I listen to non-Muslim historians about Jesus and what they have to say. I look at what scholars are describing. I look at the information that they have presented. And I feel that persons like yourself, with all due respect, are not paying close enough attention to the specific matter of redaction criticism to look at how the material has changed as we go from Mark to Matthew and Luke, and then finally John.
Okay, let me ask you a question about that. What physical evidence, do you claim any physical evidence for having knowledge that Matthew possessed a manuscript of Mark and was editing it?
This is not based on physical evidence. This is based on many centuries of historical studies. If we get two
historical
papers,
studies of what, though?
I'm getting to that. If we have two documents that are very similar to each other, we naturally wonder if there is a common source from which both documents derive. When scholars have looked closely at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they started to posit a source for the three because they're so similar in the outline of events and even in the narration of singular events within that broad outline. And the more they tried to reconstruct what that source would have been based on the common material between the three, the more and more that source looked like Mark's gospel itself. At one point, they called it an Marcus, a source of Mark, an earlier version of Mark's gospel, and eventually they felt that it's not even necessary to do that, though the nuance is necessary at times.
Believe me, I understand all that, but the problem is, have you looked at the worldview that is behind the production of these theories? Because what you're presenting to us are theories. You don't have any manuscripts of John that are different than what John is. You don't have any manuscripts of Mark. You have no solid evidence. What you have is scholars who could not believe. Well, let me just put it this way. You said Jesus predicted the apocalypse in his own lifetime, right?
No, I didn't say that.
You said, did Jesus predict the apocalypse? You said that as a Muslim you would not believe that the words attributed to him. Okay, so someone else put those words in Jesus' mouth.
This is what a Muslim would want to believe, yes.
Okay, why do you believe that the words of Jesus recorded in the gospel are talking about the apocalypse and not merely the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 24?
The studies regarding this have led to very clear conclusions. The sayings which are attributed to Jesus speak about the destruction and says that many of those who are standing here that will not taste death until it happens. And it also says that this will happen within the lifetime of this generation. This generation will not pass away until all of these things happen. Jesus looked at the temple wall, the western wall of the Jerusalem temple, and he said that the destruction will be so complete that not one brick will be left standing on another. But as Raymond Brown points out in his book, Jesus, God, and Man, the wall is still standing tall. So a Muslim would say this is not the words of Jesus. These are something else that people have attributed to Jesus.
So here's my question. Christian scholars, well, for almost 2,000 years, have answered all of those objections and demonstrated what Jesus is talking about. Why is it that you listen to and apply the liberals who do not believe in inspiration and do not believe in a prophetic voice, when you as a Muslim have already said you believe in a prophetic voice, and you would apply in interpreting the Qur'an about the sun setting in a muddy pool of water, you would interpret that in a literary genre and allow that? Why don't you allow one stone left upon another to be interpreted in the exact same way, that is complete destruction, not, well, there's a western wall over there, and I think I see 2 bricks, therefore he was wrong. I see a complete distinction in the application of that worldview that you're using to my scriptures than you would use in interpreting your own.
First of all, it's not just 2 bricks as the entire Western Wall. Second, even as a Muslim, I must have my rationality intact. I look at very clear evidence and I draw my conclusions. When something is said so clearly that it will happen and then it doesn't happen, well, then I have to admit that there is an error here. Something is wrong. And the same thing will have to be admitted whether it's about the Quran or the Hadith or any aspect of whether Muslim or Christian or Jewish or whatever text. I believe we should not sacrifice our rationality for the purpose of faith. Faith and rationality go together. One informs the other, one inspires the other.
Dr. Ally, it is your turn now to question Dr. White.
In your opening remarks, you said that Muslims here are in a dilemma because, on the one hand, the Quran approves of the Gospels, and at the same time, the Quran does not approve of doctrines which grow out of the Gospels, such as you say, the divinity of...
I didn't say that they approve the Gospels. I said that Surah 547 uses an imperative command to the Al-Injil to judge by what is contained in the Gospel, and therefore the Gospel had to exist for them to be able to fulfill the commandment that's found there in the Quran.
Yeah, I'm not asking you about anything different. That's precisely what I'm asking you about. So since you've said that, and have you paid attention to the fact that the verse says, let them judge by what God has revealed therein?
Yes.
So what does that mean to you?
Well, obviously, given the flow of 544 through 48, it is an argument, literally, for the prophethood of Muhammad. It's the Torah is sent down to Moses, in which is light and guidance. Jesus comes, he's given the Injil, he confirms what came before. The Injil has light and guidance. Now Muhammad has come, he's been given the Quran. What he is given has light and guidance. It confirms that which came before. In fact, acts as a hymen over that. And so it's an unbroken chain that is supposed to convince both Jews and Christians, I am the continuation of this thing that God has been doing all along. And so what is said is, if you will not judge, if the Jews will not judge by what's in the Torah, and if the Christians will not judge by what's in the Injil, they are kafirs, they're unbelievers, they are the unrighteous. And so they're being told to judge by what is contained in what they possess. And so the only way that could have a fulfillment is if they actually possess the Injil, in which is light and guidance. Because if what they possess has been corrupted, then there's no light and guidance left in it.
Oh, left in it. What if there is some light and guidance left in it, though all of it is not still in its original and pure form?
Well, it would seem to me that there would be some incumbent necessity upon the Quran to give warning and say, well, and here's how you determine. Because I listened to you just on Tuesday, and again, since some of these recordings are very old, I want to find out whether you still hold these positions or not. I don't want to assert something to you that you no longer hold. But you actually quoted Surah 547 from the Quran, either in a debate against the Oneness fellows, or a fellow had a very high-pitched British voice. I don't remember which one it was. Maybe that doesn't tell you anything. But you quoted it, and you said that if Christians would simply examine their traditions in depth, they would be able to see these different levels and discover the real Muslim Jesus underneath all these different levels. Is that still how you would understand?
That's part of what I would understand regarding this verse, yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I would just simply say it does not cross my mind, and I don't think it crossed the mind of Ibn Kathir or Al-Qurtubi or anybody else, that what Surah 547 is saying is, wait for about 1,400 years for redaction criticism to develop, use that to atomize the text in the New Testament, and then you'll find the Muslim Jesus. Because no one that Muhammad was talking to at that time would have any earthly idea of what in the world he was talking about. And I think that if the Quran makes an argument that was meant to be convincing to the people to whom it was addressed, they would have to have some idea what the argument was.
Okay, I'll address this in my rebuttal, but let me move to a different topic. The Gospel according to Mark, as I've said, according to these scholars, Richard Bauckham and F.F. Bruce, is the earliest of the four. Do you agree with that?
No.
I
agree with N.T. Wright. We don't know. We do not have any evidence. The early church thought Matthew was the first. A computerized study recently made Luke the first. The fact of the matter is that barring the discovery of the originals with date stamps on them, it is always a matter of conjecture. And I suggest, along with a number of scholars, that the best way to approach this is not to assume literary dependence and close the doors to everything else, But there was something else that Richard Bauckham himself, in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, emphasizes very strongly. And that is the eyewitnesses were still alive during the time of the writing of the Gospels. And there was this thing called oral tradition. I think that's why you see those differences, is because Mark's writing to one audience, Matthew's writing to another audience, Luke is writing to another audience. They're drawing from the same oral tradition, and they emphasize different aspects. Not that they're sitting there. Luke says he used other written sources. So if Luke has other written sources, I don't have any problem with that. But the idea of sitting around and creating a snowball and inserting a certain, well, let's be honest. What you're saying is they were being dishonest with the text. They were literally creating a religion that would prompt people to commit massive acts of shirk. I mean, we can't say these people were morally neutral in doing this. I think we need to be open about this. If we're going to say Paul and John especially were just really bad guys, then we need to be open in saying they're really bad guys. But no, I believe that I do not know who was written first. Mark may have been. But I actually look at the information and go, you know why most people put the dates on it that you put on Mark and those things? Because they don't believe in prophecy. They don't believe they could have prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem. You and I believe in prophecy. So I would put Mark in the late 50s at the latest, Luke and Matthew in the 60s, and some people have made strong arguments for John pre-70. I know Hebrews is pre-70. I don't think there's any question about that.
Okay. Now, you know, in previous debates, you have accused me of just following liberal scholars. And I've gone to great pains to find conservative scholars. There are very few. And you have,
very few?
And you have admitted...
Shabir, I need to bring you more books.
Okay,
Here,
maybe, but hold on. In the time that we have, I brought you Richard Bauckham, F.F. Bruce.
Yes.
Now, I know you expressed some hesitation about Richard Bauckham. I'd like to know what's wrong about him.
I didn't say there was anything wrong.
But let me get to my question.
Okay.
My question then is, are you still going to accuse me of following liberal scholars in saying that this is the date of Mark and that Mark is the earliest of the four?
I am going to accuse you of not listening to the large portion of us who argue against those things and who say the reason of the popularity in quote-unquote Christian scholarship for these things is due to an anti-supernaturalistic bias. Shabir, what I've always said to you is exactly what you said to Bob Morey in your debate when I quoted it to you. You're a supernaturalist, but you take off your supernaturalist perspective when you read our scholars, and hence you don't recognize when these folks are functioning on a foundation that says, well, it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, so it has to be after the destruction of Jerusalem.
So both Richard Bauckham and F.F. Bruce are anti-supernaturalists?
No, wait a minute. You're confusing here the order of the Gospels and the dating of the Gospels. And the idea, now someone can say, there are conservative scholars that might put Mark and Matthew and these others very late for reasons other than anti-supernaturalist ones. But the people who, for example, cut John up into parts without any historical evidence that these stages ever existed, in a way that you wouldn't even agree with the way they put it back together again, they are functioning from a worldview that fundamentally says we are embarrassed by the existence of the supernatural in our text. And so we will try to explain it away, just as you know there are liberal Muslims who are embarrassed by the presence of the supernatural in their text. But I don't think you and I are ready to explain those things away or dismiss the presence of the supernatural in our text, are we?
Unless you start saying that Bruce and Bauckham are anti-supernaturalists and they are no longer conservative scholars, I will not see your point. But I have another question for you. You have written that Mark ends with chapter 16, verse number 8, in which case you are doing away with the longer ending. Now, if Matthew was written first...
As do the earliest manuscripts.
If Matthew was written first, what would be the need for Mark? If Mark was written first, isn't it natural that,
excellent question,
that the way in which somebody has tried to improve upon Mark by giving it a longer ending, Matthew and Luke have also improved upon Mark by giving their own alternative endings?
Two things. You're not seeing what Richard Bauckham emphasizes and what F.F. Bruce emphasizes, and that is that the Gospel of Mark existed in a time when the kerygma, the spoken word, the spoken tradition, was the very essence in which that Gospel was to be presented. And secondly, you're assuming literary independence so that everybody would know Matthew, and therefore, if everybody knows Matthew, then there's no reason for Mark to have a shorter ending because there's all that stuff in Matthew. We live in a day of cell phones and PDAs and the internet and information goes around so fast, most of us can't even keep up with it. That was not the situation back then. You could live in an area of your entire life and never travel more than 7 miles from where you were born. So the idea that everybody would have known, well, Matthew's already written his gospel, it's on the internet, isn't it? There would have been Mark may have been living in a place where he's never heard of a written something called the Gospel of Matthew. And so the assumption, I think, misunderstands the context. And I didn't say that F.F. Bruce and Richard Bauckham are liberals. I said I would have differences with both of them on certain aspects, and there's a difference between the dating of the Gospels and things like that. But Bauckham himself, if you read Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, emphasizes the fact that those books were being written during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and that functioned as a control so that we can trust the text of the New Testament. So I would certainly agree with him on that matter.
Time.
10-minute rebuttals.
We now move to the next phase, which is 10 minutes each of rebuttals, starting with Dr. White.